You all know, those of you who know me know that it's definitely an area that I'm passionate about. So I'm glad to be able to talk to you this morning about some of those things that are important as we think about disproportionality. So as we get started, let me just cover a couple of things. Just first, some acknowledgments. On behalf of IDOE, again, just welcome to our discussion today. Kristen probably is muted on the line somewhere, but she's out of town at a conference, or else I know she would be joining us to welcome you herself. But this is a series, or the first in a series of webinars that we're going to be offering as part of the department's collaboration with the IDRC. And if you don't know what that means, that's the Indiana Disproportionality Resources Center. And that is really a collaborative effort between the Equity Project at Indiana University, and most of you know that that's the center that has led disproportionality efforts in the state for many, many years under the leadership of Dr. Esquiva, but also a partnership with the Rowing Corporation, who's serving as our host for today's webinar and is really going to handle any logistical problems that we might have today, but we're going to just expect that we won't have any of those. But they're also going to be charged with developing the many electronic resources that you're going to have access to across the year. So excited to be partnering with them. And then Virtuoso Education Consulting is the professional development firm that I head up, and my name is Renee Aziz. I guess I should have started by saying that, but I'm the director of PD for Virtuoso, and Virtuoso is going to be leading the technical assistance work that we do this year together. So again, thanks for joining us today. We're going to take about 90 minutes to talk today, and so as we get ready to do that, just want to share with you some logistics. Skype as a meeting app was new to me, so it might be to some of you as well. So just a couple of logistics here. You can change the view that you see by kind of clicking on the little person icon. It's the second icon from your right at the top, and when you do that, you'll have a couple of options. I suggest that you use the presentation view so that you can see all of the slides and not see the little pop-up boxes of, you know, who's talking at the time or all the attendees. And then also, most of you have figured this out because you've let me know that you could hear me, but also in the bottom left corner is that little speaking emoji, and that will open up your conversation window, and so that's how you'll be able to share your messages as you've already begun to do this morning. So you know, I want to say a bit about that conversation box. I think that you should feel comfortable typing things that are for the good of the group, questions that you might have or something you need me to clarify. Go ahead and type those things there. But if you have a real, you know, private question or something that is just in relation to your LEA, I think that it's probably the better plan not to post it in that conversation box so that everyone will see it. And this app doesn't offer us the ability just to select who we want to see our messages. So instead, today, if you have a private question, I want you to write down this email. It's Mariella's email. She's the Associate Director of the Equity Project at IU. So her email is there as well as her phone number. So she is on standby to be able to answer any of your private questions that might come up. And that might be particularly important as we start to get into our conversations about data. So if you have real private questions about that, those are your resources for that. And then we've got some materials for you today. I created a little tiny URL so you can have access to them. They're located on a box folder. in a box folder, I should say, but you can get to them by going to tinyurl.com/IndianaDispro1617. And when you go there, you'll, let me just show you what you'll see. So I'll switch my view here. Let me see. I need to share with you my internet view. So when you do that, you will see lots of resources, and we'll sort through these resources as we go along. Should be popping up here in a second for you. So you've got 5 different resources. Again, we'll talk about those throughout the morning. But the second one, this one that says Disproportionate Representation Webinar, you can download that right now, and those are the slides for today if you want to go ahead and start to look at those as we go along. So I'll pause real quick and check in with you to see if you have any questions so far. If you do, type them. If not, your lack of comments will let me know that we're ready to jump into the content here. All right, seems like you got logistics down then. So you might be wondering who's on the call. As Kristen and I were making our initial calls, we informed you that this is really the call for all of us who are in the situation. And I say us because I'm in it with you. I'm going to support you along the way as you develop your corrective action plan. So it really is I see it as a collaborative effort. You're not going to be alone as you deal with these issues. But today we've got on the line all LEAs that have been cited by the Department for Disproportionate Representation. And this year you can see that we didn't have anyone cited for Indicator 4, which is related to discipline. But instead this year we're focused on Indicators 9 and 10. So we've got LEAs that are out for overall representation of African American special ed students, and then we've got some specifics around eligibility categories. So we've got SLD, 3 folks out for that. We've got 4 for autism, 1 for cognitive, another for SLD or 2 for Hispanic SLD, and OHI as well for multiracial students. So I wanted to just present that so that you know that for most of you, you at least share a colleague that is trying to resolve an issue similar to you. And if you're one of the folks on the line that doesn't have anyone that's dealing with the issue with you, then you know even more that I'll be supporting you on a more individualized basis so that we can think together about how the problem is manifesting in your specific district. So pop in for a minute and share with me the roles that are represented on your team today. So, for example, you know, you might have the special ed director. I've seen many of you already post, but maybe your RTI coordinator is also on the line, or your director of curriculum. Maybe even you've got an assistant superintendent. So I want you to just take a minute and let me know who's represented on your team today. Make sure you put the LEA that you're with so that I'm just going to kind of take attendance as I see and make sure everyone that I expect to be on the call is. So go ahead and take a minute to let us know who's attending today in the chat box. You don't have to give names, just roll. Team there. Wow, great. Super exciting. So I'm confident that the content we'll talk about today will be beneficial to all involved. Maybe this will be confirmation of things you already know for some of you who've been along this journey for a while, but for maybe some of your colleagues, it'll be good information that will empower them to be able to talk with you to other colleagues in the district about the needs and how to resolve the issues. So let's keep pressing forward here. So today's agenda, we are going to talk briefly about what we mean by disproportionate representation, and then I'm going to jump into the meat of the presentation, which is really focusing on the essential task that I have learned from my experience working with many districts not only in Indiana, but across the nation on resolving disproportionality, really some things that it takes for you to be able to remedy the issue before it becomes an issue where you have to dedicate some of your federal Part B dollars to resolve. So we'll go through those things, particularly root cause analyses, thinking about data, and then coordinating a district leadership team to help you really talk about these things. We'll talk about each of those three things. I'll give you some application time as we go along, and then we'll wrap up with thinking about next steps on this journey. So I want to start with thinking about what we mean by disproportionality. So I'm going to, again, ask you to give me some feedback. So I want you, in a second, I'm going to show you a poll question. I want you to respond to the poll question to indicate your team's level of knowledge about disproportionate representation. And notice the key word in that phrase is team. So I know some of you will be experts, but I want you to think about the group as a whole. Think about the nature of the knowledge of the team as you respond to the question. So the question is, how knowledgeable is your team about the differences between disproportionate representation and significant disproportionality? So would you say that as a team you're very knowledgeable and you can articulately explain those differences to your colleagues? So I typed this quickly, so sorry. Would you say that you understand the basics, but you would need some additional resources to discuss the specific differences with your colleagues? Or would you say that you understand the issue has to do with this imbalance of your special ed numbers, but you really can't discuss how this is determined by the state, et cetera? So give me your votes, and I'll show you the results of that poll once I see everyone's responded. Nice. Very good. Thank you for your responses. I think everyone has responded. So I'll show you what we see here. So most of us say that we of course understand the basics, but we'd probably be able to benefit from additional resources to be able to really talk about this articulately with our colleagues. And we've got some folks on here that are pros, right? They've been working on this issue for a long time, or at least have been deeply involved in understanding the nuances. So good. I'm glad. I expected most of you to be in that middle piece, and I actually built resources with the assumption that that's where you'll be. So that's a good sign for us. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about the differences between disproportionate representation and significant disproportionality. It is a nuance that's important to be able to talk with your colleagues about articulately. So as I mentioned, you could have disproportionate representation for indicator 4 as well, but this year we don't have that with anyone on the line, so I'm not even going to talk about that. Instead, I want to focus on what your needs are, and those are indicators 9 and 10. So as you can see here, what indicator 9 means is that the data that you submitted to your LEA, around your LEA, shows that the rate at which a particular racial or ethnic group of students who are identified as students with disability for any category is twice as likely or higher than all other racial or ethnic groups of students who are identified. So again, indicator 9 is about overall representation, but indicator 10 then, as you probably know, gets into the specifics of specific disability categories. And again, the nuance there is that instead of looking overall, we're looking within specific disability categories, but the measurement is the same. We're looking for a rate twice as likely or higher. in terms of a specific racial or ethnic group being identified compared to other groups in that same category. So when you think about the threshold, which is the all-important quantitative measure, the threshold of those values, again, is 2.0. And so that means that if your quantitative numbers come up with a risk ratio, let's say for African Americans and as being identified with a specific learning disability, if their rate for identification in that category is twice as likely than all other special ed students under that category, then that's going to cause a red flag for you. And when the Equity Project is determining those numbers, they make sure that they're using an n-size of 15, and you've got to have that risk ratio of 2.0 or higher for 2 years in a row. And you can see here on the screen the specific disability categories that are monitored. Those are ones that I know that you're familiar with. But the important thing to differentiate between disproportionate representation and significant disproportionality is that next bullet point, and that is if an LEA exceeds that numerical criteria, right? So your numbers are elevated, it's 2.0 or higher, then you have to do that kind of self-assessment survey and get a file review to determine if those elevated numbers are due to inappropriate identification. And as Kristen and I were chatting with you all initially on the phone, you talked about the results of your file review and already have some really good strategies in place for addressing some of the things that came out of the file review. So what I want you to take away from this is indicator 9 is about all over or overall over identification or elevated numbers of a particular racial or ethnic group. Indicator 10 is thinking about it, the representation of specific racial or ethnic groups, but within disability categories. In both situations, the numbers have to be above 2, have to have at least 15 students in the threshold or in the specific cells for 2 years in a row. And based on a file review, there has to be some evidence that part of the issue is about some practices that don't align with Article 7 criteria. So here just lays out some of that process. So this might be a good slide to share with folks back in your district or with your colleagues who just need some succinct points to help them understand that there's a two-step process. One, the quantitative findings, which we just discussed, but then the qualitative findings of file reviews based on Article 7. And I will say, in some states, this is not the case, but in our state, we're really thinking about over-representation and not under-representation. You know, you could have disproportionality both ways, but here you only get that finding of noncompliance if it's over-representation. So to distinguish that from significant disproportionality, again, you could have this overall noncompliance, so that's not really looking at specific discipline, or not discipline, but disability category. So overall special ed numbers, that's one area of noncompliance. But then we also look at disability categories, much like we do in disproportionate representation. We also look at issues of LRE, insignificant disproportionality, and discipline. And for those things, the criteria is a risk ratio of 2.5 times or higher. And that risk index, or the risk for a specific ethnic or racial group, has to be greater than the overall state risk. Again, we maintain that 15 students in the cell size to make sure that our statistics are not highly volatile based on small numbers. And again, we're just looking at overrepresentation with significant disproportionality. disproportionality. Now, the distinguishing factor here is not only the elevated quantitative, right, so 2 versus 2.5, but also, and these are cases that you get cited on without a review of your specific policies, practices, or procedures. So with significant disproportionality, we're not really looking at evidence of inappropriate identification. That's really the focus on disproportionate representation. So those are the highlights. Those are the takeaways that I would say that you really need to share with your colleagues back in the district, because sometimes people, I think, in my experience, feel like they're being penalized or having to address an issue based on some small numbers that happen all over, etc. And they don't really understand the nuances of how the citation comes about. So just being able to understand the behind-the-scenes processes that come with the citation, I think, is an important first step. I would also say that getting into that conversation of sharing with your colleagues, I think it's really important as you begin to identify effective strategies to include in your corrective action plan. Right now, you're already thinking about, okay, well, our issue is about something that might be related to inappropriate identification. So you immediately jump into action thinking about all the things you need to do to correct those kind of files. And again, I get that, and that it's really natural to find yourself focusing most prominently on those errors that were identified in your file reviews. But I really think that that approach, while an important first step, is not the only thing that you need to do. I would really encourage you to use this experience, while there's no money involved, use this experience as an opportunity to think systematically. So could your citation be a warning sign for additional issues that are more deeply rooted in your district or in the system? And so this citation just be the canary in the coal mine. This is one of the go-to sayings that we use at the Equity Project, that sometimes disproportionality is just the warning sign that we have a bigger systematic issue. And I have to tell you, those of you who are on the line having to deal with this issue, it's very natural for people who are in disproportionate representation to just think about correcting the files, because ultimately that's going to, if you get the numbers down and you correct the files, then you're going to be released from noncompliance. And all of us want that, but I've seen time and time again when people don't think systematically, they find themselves back in the scenario, or even worse, in significant disproportionality, because they haven't really addressed the more systematic issues. So with that said, I want us to shift our attention to begin to think about those root causes that might be at play. I'll pause real quick and have you just check in, see if anyone has questions. All righty. So I don't see anyone typing, so I'll keep moving here. So I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk to you about some essential tasks for addressing disproportionality. And the three things we'll talk about are root cause analysis, data analysis, and district leadership teaming. And I want to first start with thinking about root cause analysis. I know that you have already submitted your responses to the root cause analysis, and I asked many of you when we were making our initial calls your process for that. If you have people on the line with you right now that weren't a part of that root cause analysis, I think shortly here will be an opportunity to explain to those people what that was all about. And in fact, I'm going to give you an opportunity to really push your thinking on root cause analysis. But as we get our discussion started, I want to just mention that in addition to reviewing the quantitative and qualitative findings of noncompliance, as I said, you were asked to complete a root cause analysis focused on 4 major areas that are often contributing factors to disproportionality. You can see those areas here. So we're thinking about data, policies and procedures, practices, and staff development. Some of you in your submissions to Kristen, to the department, were very comprehensive in the resources that you provided as you indicated your rating. So you attached lots of policies that you had in place. You gave examples of the kind of data reports that you run. You talked about all the different professional development topics that you covered. So you provided evidence of things that are in place in the district. And I thought that was great that you had attached those things as you were thinking about root cause. So in my initial conversations with many of you, you might remember that I asked if you quantified your ratings in any way as you were filling out the root cause analysis. And a couple of you said that you did, but what we often see is that in our initial conversations about root cause, we're really way more subjective in nature than we need to be. So when we're more subjective, we're often subject to what I call confirmatory biases. And by that, I mean that you already know about practices and policies that exist, right? That's why you provided all the evidence of those things. And so you rate those things as either a lot or very much in place, right? That's a natural thing. You know, well, yeah, we have that policy, so yeah, it's in place very much. But in essence, your ratings kind of confirm that which you believe or have experienced without explicitly considering the times in which these things may not be the case. So instead of looking for the evidence of it being true, what I prompt people to do in root cause analysis is to think about all the times where that is not true. Again, that's not my experience in watching most people go through the root cause analysis process initially. So I want to offer you to think about root cause analyses that are useful and not just about a district's intention, because I think we all have good intentions, but think about the degree to which you're making sure that folks are accountable for the implementation of the policies, of the procedures, of the practices. So what I'm getting at here is the nuance between intention, yes, we have that in place, versus are we doing it with fidelity? Are we holding people accountable for all of those great things we have in place? And so I like to use this analogy as I think about the systemic roots of a problem of disproportionality. I like to use this image of a very mature tree, right? That's what we see with our physical eyes. You see a nice, big, fully developed tree with lots of leaves and branches, etc. Oftentimes, I think this is a powerful image to represent our districts. We've got long-standing policies, procedures, practices that are so deeply rooted that they just become part of our identity as a corporation, as a district, right? Even as a school. So as you connect that analogy with your current situation, there might be some things that have some shallow roots, right? That haven't been in place that often, or as you try to resolve disproportionality, are easy fixes, right? An easy fix is a file review. Easy fix, right? You can tell people, no, here's our expectation. We want you to use this systematic observation form. We want you to make sure you interview two resources or 2 people that know the student instead of 1. You know, all those really easily changeable things, right? I call those shallow roots. Maybe another shallow root is doing a PD for your staff around expectations, around some of those policies or procedures. So when I talk about shallow roots, I'm talking about the quick fixes, those things that you can change easily. There are other things, though, that I think have a bit more established roots, and those might be intermediate roots. So maybe you've got policies and procedures that are important to think about there, right? Things that have been in place for a while, but probably need to be changed, and actually people might be open to having changes in that area. But I think you'll need to have multiple perspectives about the culture of the district in terms of how things are done. So that's why one of the reasons I asked you to really have a diverse team on this call today, because as you think about the systemic things in the district, you need to have various people's perspectives on how those things are playing out. So a question for you to consider is, might traditional practices and procedures be in need of revision, given the changes in maybe your student population or even your teacher demographics? Again, those things might be intermediate routes that might take a little more time and effort to start to change and impact, but still critically important. Finally, the best root cause analyses, I think, get down to those factors that are deeply rooted in a district. And these are what I typically refer to as, those of you who know me know that I love the analogy of elephants in the room. So I think your deeply rooted things are your elephants. And these are typically things that many people know are problematic, but are talked around instead of being addressed head on. So in the case of disproportionality, this is particularly important when we're dealing with outcomes that impact students of specific cultural backgrounds, right? That's what disproportionality is. It's about specific disparate outcomes for specific racial or cultural groups in either an overall or specific disability category. And let me just make a point there. When I use the word culture, I'm not solely talking about racial or ethnic culture, although that's what you have to think about, but do know that culture can refer to many aspects of our identity that make us uniquely different. So one of the things I often hear from folks who are cited particularly for things like overrepresentation of white students and autism, sometimes based on our initial thoughts about culture, we don't even see that as cultural, but it absolutely is. First of all, we have many cultural identities, and being white can be a cultural identity. It's usually not anybody's only cultural identity, but it certainly is one that needs to be considered. And also, autism is a cultural identity. And one of the things you have to think about if you're dealing with that issue, but not only that issue, any of these issues, is the intersectionality. I know that's a big word, but the intersectionality between those two things, meaning if I'm white and I have autism, is that seen differently than if I'm Black and I have autism, or if I'm Hispanic and I have autism, seen differently by my educators, seen differently by my family, seen differently by my cultural groups. Those are some deeply rooted conversations that I'm suggesting you need to have if you're to really do a good root cause analysis. Your root cause analysis should have you thinking about things that just don't automatically come to you as you go through those questions. So it's really a task that I say it should take place over time. Sometimes I see people sit in a meeting and get it done, and I know the reason for that is because time is a four-letter word in schools. We never have enough time up. We never have enough time. It's a bad word for us, right? But the intention of the root cause analysis is to challenge you to think more deeply about systemic roots. So I want to give you an opportunity to go deeper. So I want you to think about, along with your team members, how you're going to dig deeper as you think about root causes of disproportionality in your setting. So as I mentioned earlier, identifying root causes isn't just about the existence of a particular best practice, but it's more about the ways in which all those components are implemented. So some questions I want you to think about is, how do you know if your policies, procedures, and practices are benefiting all students equally? How do you know if your staff are implementing those things with fidelity? Are your procedures applied equally for all students? And another one is, are your practices culturally relevant and meeting the needs of students? And before I let you talk about that, as a team, you might be saying, okay, practically speaking, I'm out for multiracial OHI. Like, how am I thinking about all of these things with that one issue? Remember the focus. The focus is whether or not that is an issue that's just a canary, just an indicator of some things that might be disparate across the system. So I want you to think specifically about your area of noncompliance, but as you do that, contextualize that conversation in deeper thought about more systemic issues. So I'm going to let you get started on those things. And so as you have some reflection time, I want you to consider your approach to completing your root cause analysis. Again, Kristen and I have talked to you all about your general process, but I really want you to take another opportunity to think about the lenses that you use. Did you use those really multiple perspectives? Did you get all the voices that you needed? Think about those deeper level questions that we just talked about and any other additional factors that you might need to consider related to root cause. And then I want you to have that conversation. We're going to take about maybe 10 minutes, maybe 7 minutes or so to have this conversation. And I'll give you a 2-minute warning. I want you at that 2-minute warning to start wrapping up your conversation and post your next steps related to that area, right? To the area of exploring root causes more deeply. So what I am assuming is that all of you, even though you have submitted your root cause analysis, will, from our discussion this morning so far, be open to taking a deeper look. That's my expectation. So again, post your next steps related to that area in the chat window when you hear my 2-minute warning. So go ahead and get started. If you have clarifying questions, post those in the conversation window, and we'll respond to those as well. Problem solving, again, confirmatory bias is a real thing. And so it's hard for us to step outside of our everyday and look at things from different perspectives. So because I'm seeing some actions here, this is why I feel the need to prompt you to think about this. I'll put this resource in the box folder, but I want you to just take some notes for a moment about a process that I train lots of people on called ORID, the ORID process for having a discussion. It could be a data discussion. It could be a discussion about root cause. It could be a discussion about leadership, about anything really that happens in the context of schools or even outside of schools. But for you, I want to offer you this acronym, or it is an acronym that stands for the four levels of data conversation. O, which stands for objective level, which is really when you just examine the data, identify the factual information. When you're engaging at the objective level of ORID in your district, you're going to be really looking at your area of noncompliance, just talking about the actual numbers. What does our risk ratio say? How does that compare to other ethnic or racial groups, etc.? I call that just the facts, please. So what factual statements can you make about the data? The next level in ORID is R, and that's when you want people to be reflective in what they think about the data. So that's to encourage participants to make connections, to have just kind of a free flow of ideas, again, about what they think about the data. So particularly what surprises them, what encourages them, what discourages them even. That's really important, because the truth of the matter is, when it comes to disproportionality, some of us experience some barriers to problem solving because we don't do enough reflection. Sometimes people need to actually get out how they feel about that issue. Some people might say, I feel that it's extremely inappropriate to be identified as having disproportionate representation given X. You need to be able to have people express that so that you can either be aware of the fact that you may too feel that way, and that could potentially be an area that you need to work through in order to make good progress on resolving the issue, or if you don't share that belief, then that belief is important for you to know so that you can speak to it as you get people to try to get to action. So that's the R level. The next level is interpretive level, and that's about identifying your areas of strength or patterns or the trends that you think could be contributing to the reasons why you have the data the way that it is. So for some of you, I saw that you're like, well, we've got a lot of, in particularly the case of outside organizations influencing criteria about disability. Well, that's why that's one reason you're interpreting having an increase in a certain population around a certain disability, right? So at the interpretive level, what you're really trying to discern is, why do you think the patterns exist? So what might be the underlying root causes, right? And then finally, and only finally, after you've gone through those first three steps, is the decisional level. That's when you propose next steps and begin to make an action plan. So the reason why I was prompted to share this with you is because I see tons of educators across many issues, not just disproportionality, but our instinct as problem solvers is to immediately go to the decisional level. So we're already going to do X, then Y, then Z. But we do that without really reflecting on an objective level, really saying what all the facts are in their entirety, reflecting on how we feel about that, and then thinking about underlying causes. So I think you got a good start here. I'm going to prompt you again to be more reflective, to think about what the underlying causes of those things might be. But as you've captured in your conversations on the chat, I think you're off to a good start. Again, my job is to support you in digging deeper always. Was there anyone that wanted to share using their speaker? It looks like everyone posted, although I thought I saw that Lawrence's was cut off. So, Shauna, if you wanted to share with your mic, that's good. Oh, I see it now. Okay. So I think everyone shared then. Great. Do you have questions about that? What is not connecting with you? Tell me that too if something doesn't seem to be connecting with you. Okay, well, tell me all good then. Something. It's hard not to see you. Good. Thanks, Sean. I appreciate you. So some additional resources that are located on the box folder. Remember that tiny URL that I gave to you earlier. So we've got some guiding discussion questions that the Equity Project developed, and these are going to help you have deeper conversations about root cause. Some of you on my initial conversations with you were saying, we've done this type of root cause a couple of times. We might want to think about some other things to think about, or have another tool that can help us think about things a little differently. So I've put for you on the box a resource from the IDEA Center, IDEA Center. It's called the Success Gaps tool. And in addition to policies and procedures and practices, staff development, all that stuff, these are also, they have some additional areas that you can consider in terms of a root cause. So they have some questions around culturally responsive practices, around your core instruction, particularly important for those of you out for SLD or OHI, assessment, again, particularly important for some of you who are more out for maybe an autism issue or cognitive issue, and then interventions. What are you doing before going into that evaluation process? So I want you to, as next steps, think about using the tool that you've already completed and thinking deeper about that, but also then using the discussion questions and potentially the Success Gaps toolkit to deepen the ways in which you think about your issue. All right, so moving on to data. Let's talk about data analysis and monitoring. So, you know, I never know how much to share about data because it can be dry sometimes, but I want to just highlight some of the things that are important. First of all, the use of data to clarify your hypotheses that you're going to develop from your root cause is really important in order to confirm or exclude those hypotheses. So part of your work as you dig into the root causes is to say why you think that's happening and then get the data for that. So if your data confirms that, yep, it is that we have an abundance of students who move in with this label, then okay, that hypothesis is confirmed. Or it's because we have these really excellent outside centers that are doing great work with a particular population and that's influencing our outcomes. We'll confirm that with data and then engage in conversations about, well, why are those organizations impacting certain students and not others, right? So you have to, that'll lead you to the next level of conversation. But the data analyses that you do should be disaggregated by race, gender, disability category, and all the other relevant subgroups that you need to determine related to trends in your data. So when you're doing data analysis, I don't want you to just focus on the data that you already know about around your area of non-compliance, but look at other data that can, again, either confirm or challenge you to think differently about things. What comes to mind, I just was working in a district the other day, and we were looking at disproportionality, right? They're out of compliance for a discipline issue, but many people say, well, our issue has to do with poverty. And so we looked at poverty, and while it was true that the majority of students who were being suspended were receiving free lunch, when we looked within groups, so we took all the free students and then looked by racial and ethnic categories. We took all of the reduced students and looked by race and ethnic categories. We took all of the paid students and looked within at specific race and ethnic differences. What we noticed is that the most disproportionality happened across students who were in paid lunch. So paid lunch students in this particular district were 3.5, Black students who were paid lunch were 3.5 times more likely to be suspended, right, compared to their other students who were on paid lunch. And for the students who were receiving free lunch, that difference was only 2.2 times more likely. So that helped us exclude the focus on that cause alone. Doesn't mean that we abandon the exploration of how we see differences across poverty, but it challenges us to not say that's the only issue. And that's what I want you to do as you look at your data about your area of noncompliance. Challenge yourself to say, well, how might I think about this differently? So some important calculations to do this. You all are probably familiar with these three calculations. So the first is composition index, the second is risk, and the third is risk ratio. These are things that you want to be able to be an expert on so that you can communicate these to your colleagues, because this is where the most myths happen. People will think, well, the data's not fair because X, and what they're really, how they're talking about the data is not quite accurate. So I want you to know about these calculations so that you can engage in accurate conversations with your colleagues. So when we think about composition index, we're just talking about the percentage of students from a particular subgroup in a particular category. So if we're using a composition index, we're just saying, are there more students in a given group than we would expect given their proportion in the population, right, in the district? Simple, just composition of enrollment versus enrollment and outcome. The risk index is really related to the percentage of a subgroup that's placed in a particular category. And since we're talking about special ed, we'll use that word, a particular special ed category. So when we use a risk index, what we're asking is, what's the risk that a student from a specific group will be served in special education or in a specific disability category, right? And then the final calculation is that relative risk. This is the risk that is the trigger for either disproportionate representation or significant disproportionality. But it's what's the comparison of those two risk indices for one group versus another. So it addresses the question, how much more or less likely is a student from a particular racial or ethnic category compared to other students to be serviced in a specific area or outcome. So I want you to make sure that you understand those calculations, again, so you can have conversations in your district. And as you're having those conversations, I think that you should be proactive in monitoring your data and having an ongoing, it should be scheduled there, right? So I think that it's important for the districts that I see I have the most success have an ongoing schedule for looking at disaggregated data. And sometimes they identify that they don't really have the data systems they need in order to be able to do that. So that's for you to consider as well. Do both your internal and external resources provide you with the information that you need? So thinking about your current data system as well as the Equity in Indiana website, which hopefully you have some familiarity with. But I'm going to give you a second to think about these two things, but if you aren't familiar with the Equity in Indiana website, it's really a resource for you. The Equity Project every year posts the yearly data, and it's all private and password protected, but each LEA is able to access their individual enrollment, demographic, identification, placement, discipline, all that stuff is at this site. And so this is a good resource for you to, again, monitor and develop some goals around, but then use your internal data system to think about progress and to look at your data on a more ongoing basis. So I'm going to give you a minute to just browse this website just so that you know where to get to it. You're going to need to engage in more conversation about this offline here. But as you look at that website, you think about what's helpful or what additional information you're going to need to, again, go back to what you thought about in your root causes and think about what other information might I need to, again, confirm or exclude our hypotheses about why our issue is occurring. And then I'll have you post your next steps. But let me just show you real quick what you should see. So if you go to that website, what you're going to end up seeing is, again, you're going to need your password for this, and Kristen, I think, shared it with many of you on an email. But what you should see is disproportionality in special education and school discipline. And since all of you are out for discipline and placement, you'll go to that tab, and then you'll click LEA data and choose the appropriate alphabet sequence for you. And then let's say I'm Adams, which nobody is, but you should have your password for that, and press submit, and it'll show you your data. Okay? So Kristen, again, sent those out. If you don't have access to this right now, that's okay. You can email Mariella if you don't have the password. If you don't have access to this right now, what I'm going to ask you to do instead is to think about your internal data system and make sure that it is giving you the information around composition, risk, and risk ratio that you need in order to monitor trends around disproportionality in your district. So we'll be brief on this part. I just want you to take a few minutes to engage in conversation about those things. So I'll probably go 5 minutes, knowing that that's not enough time for you to really plan, have a plan of action, but start talking about your data needs and how what access you do have to data, how that helps you with your hypotheses. That's the real question. All right, so 5 minutes. Yeah, you guys have gotten, I like your ideas about data. I support all of them. You probably didn't have time to look on the Equity in Indiana website, but make sure you use that resource. I think it's an untapped resource. And again, yeah, it is only about, it's about special ed trends, but again, it will allow you to look at patterns across time and be able to set goals. So don't forget about using that resource. I want to show you a couple of things that is in your box folder. So let me just share that screen with you real quick here. So in the box folder is, let's see, make sure you're seeing what I'm seeing. If you go to the box folder, you're going to have a tool. The first tool there is called the Data Analysis Workbook. Looks like it's still loading. I can see it, but I don't know if you can. I got a funny message. I don't know if you can see this or not. Maybe you're looking at box independently, but when you get to that box, you will have something called the Data Analysis Workbook, which is really a good tool. It's a tool that's developed by a sender out of New York that does a good job with providing technical assistance on disproportionality. It's like the New York equivalent of the Equity Project. That's like how I like to think about it. But that is a good workbook that will help you be able to put together the ways in which you start to look at disproportionality, really focusing on those three metrics we talked about: composition index, risk, and relative risk. So I'm going to push us forward to the last piece that we don't have a lot of time for, but I hate that it's come to this, but the district leadership team is a piece that people really minimize. And you're like, oh, we don't need another team. We don't need another team in our district, but maybe that's true. But I want you to think about the functions of a district leadership team because they're critically important for resolving disproportionality. And here's the key: for staying out of disproportionality. Anybody can get out of it. That's easy. It's staying out of it that's not the easy part. But the district leadership team is really the mechanism that helps you do that. So that important process, I hate that I'm having to minimize, but as I share with you these last few slides, the important function of the DLT is to really serve as that organizing structure for accomplishing the other two tasks that we talked about. So this is the team or the process through which we think about assessing levels of fidelity related to our policies, practices, and procedures. This is the team that comes together to monitor data. This is the team that talks explicitly about equity, even when it's uncomfortable to do so. And ultimately, this should be the team that develops your action plan to address noncompliance. I know lots of pressures put on the special ed director, but they're not in this alone. So it really needs to be a team that comes up with that action plan, maybe under the leadership of the special ed director, but not independent, and not as an independent person. And I think they would all agree with that statement. So the DLT process is a process that's been in place for a while. I first learned about this process years ago when I was actually a student under Russ Skiba at the Equity Project. And officially, we refer to it as the LEAD process. But really, it starts with the formation of this multidisciplinary team that includes multiple perspectives, lots of voices, key stakeholders. The team really should be as diverse as possible, both with certified and classified people of lots of different skill levels and areas of expertise that can all share their perspectives about how policies, procedures, and practices are operating in your district. So, as I said early on, maybe this isn't another team, but maybe the existing teaming structures that you have in your district can make sure that they serve the functions of what we expect a DLT to do. So the DLT the team should really, as you've begun to do, develop hypotheses about why disproportionality is occurring. And I would expect someone on the team to be in charge of making sure that we understand the current literature about disproportionality. There's tons of it, so we need to tap into what's the research on this issue. We're not the only people in the world that have to deal with disproportionality related to specific learning disabilities. We're not the only people experiencing disproportionality around autism. So what are the trends? You all need to tap into that information and talk about it together. And as you do that, since disproportionality is an issue that impacts specific racial and ethnic groups, you've got to have facilitated conversations about race and inequity. You cannot solve disproportionality, no matter what your area of noncompliance is. You cannot resolve it and sustain good practice without having those tough conversations. As we go through the year, we're going to give you some support and thinking about how to engage in those. That's a scary thing to do, so you want to do it right, or else it can backfire on you. But know that it's critical. And then the DLT should generate an action plan, but notice I put that the action plan should be multi-tiered. It's not just about fixing the things on your file review. It's thinking about those deep-level things that you've identified in your root cause analysis. So it's going to require lots of collaboration. It's going to require ongoing conversations. It's going to require the explicit linking or connections with existing things. So you've got to identify why people should care about making changes, not just because it'll get you off the list, but what's the good? How does it connect to the things that we already value or have an initiative about, etc. But I will say this, whatever your multi-tiered action plan or your corrective action plan will include, please make sure that the interventions clearly address disproportionality. I can't tell you the number of times I see intervention plans that have great things on there. They're about best practices, but those practices in and of themselves are not going to resolve disproportionality. Most of you have great practices, and you're still in disproportionality. So how will the things that you say you're going to do on your corrective action plan really address root cause? So we don't have time for reflection because I want to honor your time. But here's the thing I do want you to do. I want you to think about whether you're going to start a new team or have an existing team and really focus on the functions of what I'm describing here, incorporate them into your existing team. The critical thing is, do you have the right voices? So take some time to reflect on whether or not that is true for you. Who are the folks that need to be represented? And if there is a current structure, can the functions of the DLT be incorporated into that existing mechanism? And again, how can you facilitate courageous conversations that are necessary and needed? And here's an important piece too. How, if you have those conversations, how do you prompt challenging reflections, particularly the opinions of those in power whose ideas may need to be challenged, right? So you can have a great conversation. Let's say you're talking about something about African Americans being overrepresented in a particular category. And again, the most powerful person on the team says, oh, that's an issue of poverty, where it's not at all about ethnicity, right? Maybe others of you on the team don't share that, but if, again, the most powerful person is influencing that tone, how are you going to challenge that? Those are things that you really have to think about, or otherwise your silence sometimes represents agreements. Always remember that. If we're not careful about how we speak up to things, then people can misinterpret our silence as an agreement, and we don't want that, especially when it comes to these issues. So I want you to think about how you're going to accomplish this task in your district. Again, I won't make you share right now about how you're going to do that because I want to end the webinar, but some additional resources for you on that are, again, located in your box folder, all about the lead model. I've shared kind of what that process looks like, and it gives you some prompting questions, etc. So I think it'll be a good resource for you to kind of think about how to organize the conversations that you need to have as a part of this team. And again, remember, the team is responsible for thinking about root causes and looking at data on an ongoing basis and having these really important conversations. So as we wrap up your next steps, I mentioned to those of you on the initial calls that we're going to have some additional webinars. There'll be a little more intentional or focus, not intentional, but focus next time around. So we're going to just hone in on the particular issue that you're dealing with. I'm going to reach out to you all before that and get your sense of what your greatest areas of discussion are as I put those together. But we'll do one for autism, we'll do one for SLD. But because there's just one of you that has an issue with OHI or CED, or there's one for LSI, I'm going to do more individualized support in those areas. And I'm always happy to communicate with anyone who feels the need to have something additional to the webinar. Just be in contact, let me or Kristen or Mariella know that you have an additional need, and we're here to give you as much support as we can. But those are some next steps, and we're going to be finalizing those dates midweek next week and get those out to people. So your to-dos are to identify who you're going to have participating in those March webinars or individualized meetings, and then develop a schedule for yourselves on implementing the things that we talked about today based on the function of your DLT and how the DLT will really look at root cause and data analysis. Make sure that you've captured some of the next steps that you've articulated here today. And remember, all of those tasks should really be a part of your corrective action plan that is going to be due to Kristen by April the 10th. So I'm going to take a moment for questions. Just pop them into the conversation, or you can unmute your mic and ask them aloud. Later on today, you're going to get a link for an evaluation. You just give us your feedback on this, just your honest opinions on the effectiveness of this format and the content that we discussed. So look out for that evaluation, and you can feel free to share it with all the folks that are on your team. You don't have to just submit one group evaluation. You all could do it. So as we wrap up, what questions do you have? No one's typing. That always makes me nervous. There's no questions. Just as you're typing. Great. Thanks, Sharon, for letting me know. So there's going to be a great, fancy, new, shiny website, chock full of lots of information and resources for you. It's coming soon. So stay tuned with that. Kristen will send updates about when that will go live, but I think you'll really appreciate the resources there. We'll also have like all of our recorded webinars will live there. So even if you're not out for autism this year, but you are worried about that issue, you can view that webinar. You all have Kristen's email. I've indicated the Equity Project folks' contact information there, and then mine as well. So be sure to let us know how we can help you best. That's what we want to do. So be in touch with any needs that you have. So I'll stay on the line for a moment if you have specific questions. If not, thank you so much for your time this morning, and I'll chat with you next time around.